this business plan sucks, you're going to fail.
Why should somebody trust Proton?
What we're really trying to do is provide an alternative way for you to have identity online, and an identity that you actually control.
What can we do as end users?
I think that's very regrettable, and that's what's led to a large number of scams in this area. It's pretty scary.
Last month, I had the privilege of visiting the Proton offices in Geneva, Switzerland. I got to meet the teams behind Proton Mail, Proton Calendar, Proton VPN, and a bunch of the other services of theirs that I use and have been using for a number of years. One of my favorite parts was getting to sit down with founder and CEO Andy Yen. I got to ask him a lot about his views on privacy in general and where we're headed in the digital space. Although I wasn't sure I was going to be publishing the whole video, the feedback I got from many of you is that you would like to hear the interview in its entirety. So here it is. You seem to approach Proton as more of like a science-based company as opposed to like a tech company. Mm-hmm. Can you explain a little bit of what that means to you?
Yeah, I think that comes from the background of the people in the business. Unlike most other tech companies out there, Proton wasn't created out of a business school, business plan.
Yeah.
There actually was no business plan at the beginning. In fact, it was a bunch of physicists and scientists working at CERN who shared a vision and didn't have, let's say, any business sense on how to achieve that mission. And I think that's actually a good thing, because if we had a business background or went to business school, probably everyone would have told us, don't do this, right? Mm-hmm. Because the pitch in 2014 was very simple. We're going to compete against the world's biggest tech company and charge people for something that Google gives away for free, and that's going to succeed. Any venture capitalist or any business person say that this business plan sucks, you're going to fail.
Yeah.
But I think the fact that we were scientists, the fact that we were so naive, allowed us to pursue this path without thinking of how we would make money from this in the first place.
Yeah.
And that scientific grounding is probably what makes Proton a very different company from a culture standpoint, from a value standpoint, from an ethics standpoint, in terms of what's important to us. Because it was never really about making a huge financial success. It was really about having the right scientific impact to really build a better world and to bring products to life that we think the world needs today more than ever.
Yeah. You guys are not, owned by another company, or, you're not responsible to any venture capitalist or anything like that. So you have to support what you do by making money. Do you think that actually improves and makes what you do better because you're having to do it all kind of bootstrapped?
Well, Proton isn't just bootstrapped. It's actually a bit step beyond that, which is it's crowdfunded.
Okay.
Many people don't realize this, but the reason the company exists today is because in 2014, 10,000 people from around the world got together on Indiegogo and donated money to create the business.
Okay.
And what does that mean long run, right? People say, well, your crowdfunding was 2014. It was 9 years ago. Why is it still relevant today? Well, it's relevant today because the entire business, all of us here, all the employees, we now have actually a permanent obligation to the community that supported us early on. So, we actually owe it to these people who gave up substantial amounts of money 9 years ago to bet on a dream. And the dream, part of it has come true, but we're still actually today trying to deliver what we have promised these people 9 years ago. And I think that is a different mindset, right? It's not about what we can get out of it, but it's really about serving the sacred obligation that we have to the community from the very beginning. And that is, I think, also what makes us different, because as a community-driven company, we're responsive to the needs of the users. People ask us, what is Proton's roadmap? What are we building next?
Yeah.
Well, it's whatever people want us to do, because ultimately we work for them, not for VCs, not for investors, not for a parent company, but actually for the community.
Yeah. So, you and I were talking about this over lunch where, right now the internet is kind of built on a model where what we are given is usually a free service, and in return we are exploited for the data that we have. What can we do as end users to try to end that cycle, or to maybe even motivate companies other than Proton, of course, to actually take this type of stuff seriously?
Well, we're in a market economy, right?
Yeah.
And capitalism is, people say, the strongest force in the world.
Yeah.
But within capitalism, who is actually the most powerful force? Well, it's not the trillion-dollar companies, actually. The most powerful force in a capitalist economy, in a market economy, actually is the consumer. So the power rests with you and everybody else. It's the companies you choose to patronize, the businesses you choose to support, the accounts that you decide to create. This all impacts the business model, right? So you could decide, for example, instead of getting a Gmail account, I'm going to get a Proton Mail account. But by doing that, you've just opted out of Google's surveillance business model. So in fact, the choice belongs to people. By the decisions they make every single day, we also determine what is going to be the future of the capitalist system that we're all part of. So you might feel powerless, but actually I would say the average consumer has a lot of agency and a lot of power in deciding how this evolves and how this plays out.
Yeah, I feel like it's privacy and security feels like this deep rabbit hole where there's kind of this surface level, but if you go really deep, like it just feels like you can really get yourself lost. Do you feel like there are kind of these low-hanging fruit of things, personal pieces of data that you're most interested in helping the average consumer, or you think is most important for the average consumer to really be concerned about and take seriously?
So indeed, it's very complicated because you want to protect privacy. It seems hopeless.
Yeah.
Companies have so much data. There's so many different websites. What do you do? And when we started the Proton journey back in 2014, it was the exact same question. We believe that privacy is the most important issue of the 21st century, but who do we start? And we actually started with email.
Yeah.
And people say, well, why email? Email hasn't really been used for communications probably for 20 years, right? We use chat today to communicate. No one's paid for email since the early 90s, so why email? And the reason for email is because the key thing to protect from privacy standpoint is actually not communications, not even data. What is most important is identity. And what do I mean by that? Well, email as identity is maybe very easy to see. It is the thing that links together your whole online existence. It's the closest equivalent that you have today in the digital world to a passport. In fact, if I were to give you a choice between losing your passport versus losing your email, probably losing your email is more inconvenient, right? Your email is what identifies you online.
Yeah.
But today, your identity, in most people's cases, belongs to Google. And what does that actually mean? Well, if Google controls your identity, that's a way for them to connect all of your online activity in Google properties to a real-life identity. And that is what your profile is built around. But it's more than just Google properties. Google Ads run on most of the world's websites. Google Analytics is used by some metrics on 70% of on websites around the world.
Yeah.
So actually, Google, through its other properties, not even YouTube or Google Search or even Maps, controls and sees the large majority of the world's internet. And by having a Google account, which is your Gmail, by being signed in to Gmail, you allow Google to collect all that information into a profile linked to a real identity. So if you were to use Proton Mail, for example, and opt out of the Google account, actually what that means is Google doesn't have a profile on you anymore. You don't exist in their system.
Yeah.
And that's incredibly powerful. So that's why Proton's mission, we're not here to fix secure communications. It's a side effect. What we're really trying to do is provide an alternative way for you to have identity online in the digital era, and it's identity that you actually control. Yeah. It is not designed around exploiting you. So that's actually where you start on who you are, the essence of your being, which is your identity.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so much more to what Google tracks. Like even, and I hate saying this because, this is being shared even on YouTube, but it's like the things you watch on YouTube, the stuff that you put on your calendar, all of that stuff, it gets tracked religiously. And you talked about that being very powerful to escape from that.
Yes.
What would you say to somebody like my mom, who quite honestly, when I talk to her, just says, it's just more convenient. You know what I mean? Like, what's the argument there for the power of escaping that?
Well, if we take YouTube, for example, I do watch YouTube, and I've actually watched your channel, for instance, watching it last night, right? But you know what? I'm not logged in, right? So Google doesn't, associate my identity in real life with a watcher of your channel, right? Now, I wouldn't mind if I was publicly associated with watching your channel, but there might be other channels where I wouldn't want that out there in the world, right? So that's an example where, just because I'm not logged in, because Google is not my identity provider, I have opted out of that system. I am, not in Google's database, at least as a person with a real life identity that's tied to an account. And I think that's, something that's very simple, very easy to do, but also quite powerful. And, anybody can log out. The problem is that if you log out, you lose your email. But, Proton Mail and all alternatives, this gives you a way to work around that. So I think it seems difficult, but that's a very easy, quick step that already extracts you out of that system.
Yeah. For the past few years, we've had blockchain that has made grand promises of an alternative, a trustless alternative to a very trust-based society. What is your take, or maybe even Proton's take, on blockchain as a technology?
Well, I look at blockchain from a scientific and engineering standpoint.
Okay.
Right? And the way to look at it is this technology the best tool for solving this particular problem? And what the problem is, can be a wide range of things, because blockchain is trying to solve everything, right?
Yeah.
And the reality is, if I look at the problems to be solved and the technology available to solve those problems, it's very, very rare that I'll find a situation where blockchain actually is the best answer. So what I'm seeing in the space today, especially in Web3, is a lot of people really misusing blockchain to solve problems that are not best solved by blockchain, because it allows them to sell some sort of token and make some sort of money on the side, right?
Okay.
So I view that as a commercial motivation distorting a scientific or engineering truth. And I think that's very regrettable, and that's what's led to large numbers of scams in this area.
Yeah.
And that's really sad, because there are really actually some problems, including some that Proton is working on, where blockchain actually is the best solution. But we lose sight of that because it's drowned out among all the other stuff that's out there that is not the right use of blockchain.
Would you be willing to give like an example of what you think would be a good use versus one that you think is kind of an unfair use? Or
Well, I don't want to, let's say, throw other projects under the bus,
all right,
right?
fair enough.
But let's put it this way. If you look at all the tokens and coins that have been issued over the past 5 years,
Yeah.
and you look at how many of those projects actually succeeded and delivered on the returns that they were claiming to deliver, we're talking probably low single digits, right? Yeah. And that's, I think, a very clear example of why it's not so good. And people say, well, if you do venture investing, that's about the same. But actually, no, I would say it's actually a lot worse, right? In terms of the number of money that has been lost. And in VC investing, at least you're losing the money of rich people, right? Yeah. But here you're losing the money of average people that just got defrauded in many cases, right? Yeah. But there are applications that actually make a lot of sense. I'll give you an example maybe from the email space.
Okay.
Right? So, we do encrypted email. And there's a concept of public-private key encryption. And you encrypt with people's public keys. That's how it works. Now, how do you know a public key is authentic? It's kind of a hard question to solve.
Yeah.
Because if you encrypt with a fraudulent public key, then actually you open up that communication to being decrypted by someone that controls the fraudulent key. So the authenticity of keys is an extremely challenging problem. And what would be nice? It'd be nice if there was a pen-only, read-only ledger that recorded all the public keys in existence, and no one could modify that ledger. Well, another word for that is a blockchain, right? So that's an example where blockchain actually, from a technical standpoint, solves very cleanly a real problem in security and privacy. Yeah. And that's something that, of course, so we're going to do some work on. It's something that we've been very interested in.
Yeah.
But I don't need, for example, to have a token, or to have a coin, or to sell some sort of token to make that work, right? I just need to apply blockchain as technology, pure and simple.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can imagine that for you guys, it can be frustrating at times that a lot of the cool things that you get to work on and develop are also the things that are extremely difficult to communicate to your general user base. Would you say that's about true?
Yeah, I think, technical topics, encryption is math, right?
Yeah.
No one wants to jump into math. So, of course, it's very difficult to communicate.
Yeah.
But, we communicate when we can, right?
Yeah.
To the extent that we can. But a lot of times, it's just, we know no one is going to give us credit for doing this. We know no one is even going to understand what it is that we're doing. But, as scientists, we have a compelling need to do it anyways, let's say.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are alternatives to, Proton Mail. There are plenty of alternatives to Proton VPN. What would you say are the things that most set Proton apart, either in the way that you, let's say, own your data center or your servers, or even just in the way that the company is set up that really make that an advantage for somebody that's looking at Proton?
Well, there's many different elements that we can get into, right?
Sure.
But fundamentally, it's, I think, one of philosophy. And that goes down to why we're in this business, right? At the end of the day, we're not in the business to make the maximum amount of money. It's not the reason why you become a scientist. I can tell you there's no money in science, right? You do it because you want to work on hard problems that make the world a better place. And that philosophy translated into the product and business context means that with the scientific rigor, you're not willing to cut corners. It's not in the end about how much EBITDA you can make.
Yeah.
It's about doing things in the right way that long-term will be better for the user. So an application of this could be data centers, right? It'd be a lot cheaper for us to go to the cloud, use other people's machines, use AWS to host information.
Yeah.
Instead, we buy and assemble servers in data centers with people that go in there and physically, put things in place, right? It's way more expensive than AWS, but it gives us freedom. It means that we cannot be leveraged by third parties into doing things that might compromise user privacy. And the only reason you would do that, it doesn't make any business sense.
Yeah.
But if you subscribe to our philosophy, then it makes perfect sense. So it really a matter of philosophy. We're open source. Well, open source from a business perspective makes no sense at all. Why do you give your competition a direct look at what you're doing that is special, right? Why do you open up all your special sauce?
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't make any sense. But as a scientist, one of the key pillars of science is the notion of peer review.
Peer review, yeah.
Right? Your things must be checked by a third party in order to make sure that you yourself didn't make a mistake. Now, some companies are trying to hide their mistakes because they say, I don't want to get discovered, right? But as a scientist, actually, if you're wrong, you want to know that you're wrong. So it doesn't make any business sense, but from a scientific philosophy, it is absolutely essential. So I think the differences come from values, and this translates into a lot of very tangible differences.
Going back to even what you're saying there, like sometimes I feel like government regulation, and again, this is something we were talking about at lunch, where government regulation and or even just big tech, and there being a monopoly by Google or Apple and the distribution. How does that affect the way that Proton markets its products and gets it in the hands of people that need it?
Well, let's say the cynical way to frame this would be that all companies, such as Proton as well, we're all living on borrowed time.
Yeah.
Right. And what do I mean by that? Well, today people discover my application through Google, whether it's Google search, whether it's YouTube, whether it's Google's ad network, right? They download my product through Google Chrome or through the Google Play Store. They see ads for my product, perhaps maybe through Google's ad network, right? So everything is kind of going through the Google of Google. They control the entire distribution and advertising network of everything digital today, right? Yeah. And it's a bit scary to think about, but Google could unilaterally wake up one day and decide, I want this company to disappear from the internet. And they would be within their legal rights to do that under current law, with nothing that could block that. And that's the reality in which all digital businesses live today.
Yeah.
And it's pretty scary because it means that we've given unchecked monopoly power to a company that is unelected, not accountable to the overall social good, but accountable to maybe shareholders' interests, which, as we know, in many cases is not society's interest. And the choice that I think, politicians, but also us as consumers have to make today is, are we okay with the status quo? Because Google for sure likes the status quo, right?
Yeah.
But, do we want this to persist? And my worry, my concern is if we don't bring a change to this system today, in the long run, you entrench that power even more. Yeah. And you get to a situation where actually you cannot undo it anymore. And this is why I think it's as much as we are fighting to survive and to bring our business and our values out to the world, we will never in the long run be able to succeed unless, let's say, some constraints are put in place on Google's monopoly power. And this is why this is a very important issue that I think all companies, big and small, should be fighting about, because it really concerns and impacts every one of us.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that I was surprised to learn is that on top of the products and services that you offer, I did not realize how active that Proton is in lobbying both here in Europe as well as in Washington, D.C. Like, is that seems to be an important part of what you do, at least to you. Is that correct?
Yes, and it comes down again to a matter of values, right? Yeah. If your goal is to make the maximum amount of money, well, you pay your fees to Google and Apple, you keep your head down, and you try to collect as much as you can for yourself, right? And that's it. But if you care about where the internet is going to go in the long run, if you care about the future and what it looks like 10, 20, 30 years from now, then you realize that you need to fight this core, corruption of the internet's original vision here and today, because in 20 years it's too late.
Yeah.
So we have no profit, let's say, from staffing people in DC and in Brussels to do the grueling work of talking to lawmakers and educating them on this issue.
Yeah.
There's no immediate ROI from that, right? Investor looks at that and say, this is ridiculous. You're wasting your time and your money. You'll never win.
Yeah.
But in the long run, in 30, 40 years, it's absolutely essential that these efforts take place. And we haven't had very much success in the US so far. But in Europe, for example, we've already managed, together with the help of allies, to get something called the Digital Markets Act passed. Okay. And that is going to fundamentally change the way big tech has to act and behave, at least in Europe. Yeah. So it's not an easy fight, but it's also not a lost cause. But you don't do it for, let's say, economic reasons, right? Because it's not economical. You do it because you truly believe, in the mission, and you believe in the long term.
Yeah. What would you say is the long term? Like your vision for if we were to look at a crystal ball right now and see 10 years down the road, what would you hope to see for Proton at that point?
Yes. Well, for me, actually, I don't really care if it's Proton or someone else that does it, right? Okay. I hope it'll be us, and I think it could be us. Yeah. But in the long run, what I want to see is a different way, of doing business online. Right. Today, we have entrenched a business model that really doesn't put the best interests of users and society at heart. It puts the best interests of a small number of shareholders are profiting at everybody else's expense. And what I want, and Proton's mission in many ways, is to prove to the world there's another way of doing business online. Right? You don't have to abuse user data to have a sustainable, profitable business. There's a different way of doing it. It may not make you as much money, but it's definitely much more socially responsible, and I think more aligned with what everybody actually wants. So when I think about the future, what I think about is if I go out to the average consumer on the street today, and they're, as I said earlier, the most powerful force, in the market economy, and I talked to the average consumer, I said, "This is Google's vision for the future of the internet." And if I show them also Proton's vision, I would wager that actually the majority would probably more subscribe to our vision. And that means that in a world where we can have fair play, our vision actually should be the one that prevails, because it's the one that aligns more strongly with the consumers' demands. So I'm optimistic about the future, because it's a tough fight. It's not a fair fight, but I'm very confident that I'm on the right side of history and I'm fighting on the right side. This is something that I think Google cannot really say anymore.
So I want to speak because I know, like, having been on YouTube for so many years and just online, like, cynicism runs rampant.
Yes.
And even the fact that I'm sitting here with you, there's going to be somebody that says in the comments, like, oh, sure is nice. He's cozying up to some, maybe you guys aren't considered big tech, but it's a tech company. Like, what do you say to the cynics that are like, well, Proton's just like, if you're using Proton Mail or Proton VPN, it's a centralized, we need to be moving to everything decentralized or everything trustless. Why should somebody trust Proton?
Yes. Well, there are always things that we could do differently, and arguably even better, depending on your point of view, right? But security and privacy, there will always be some level of trade-off. And there are certain choices that we make from a design perspective, which maybe would not be as private, but if you want to be very private, we would all use one-time pads, right? It'd be terribly inconvenient.
Yeah.
So that balance has to be struck. And what we try to do at Proton is try to strike the right balance, but always with the guidance of our user community. Because the community, they're the ones that we serve, right? So does that mean that we can make everybody in the community happy with every single design choice? No. But I do think our community-based approach allows us to find the community consensus and get it right most of the time. And why should you, trust Proton or any other company? Actually, well, first of all, you need to trust somebody, right? There's no such thing as trustless because technology is built by people. So even the best tech has people behind it that you need to trust. And of course, Proton being open source, being very transparent, this helps us trust. But fundamentally, you are placing trust in a person. So how do you trust in this world? Well, I think you should look at, track record. Are people consistently doing, the right things the vast majority of the time in pushing towards a particular goal? And is that a guarantee for the future? No, it isn't, right? But it is probably the best that we have. Because the reason, the way human trust works is, I trust somebody not because I met them, because of what they say, but because I see what they do, and if it's consistent with what they are saying. And that's the best that we can do, right? We like to think that technology allows us to take trust out of the equation, but actually that's not the case.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Is there anything else that you wish that more people understood about Proton or about yourself that we could communicate here before we close up?
What I would maybe say out there is, if you're a Proton user or you're a prospective Proton user, get engaged in the community. We're a company that honestly, in every product decision, takes into the account of what the users actually want. And of course, Google doesn't care what you want. Google cares what advertisers want, right? Other companies out there just want the biggest profit from you. They don't care, right? But actually, we care very deeply about it. So if there's something you want us to do differently, if there's a feature that you want, you could actually go on our social channels, to our communities on Reddit. You can make that request, right? And odds are, if it's a good idea, you're going to get what you want. So don't hesitate to engage, because that's how we make the product better. And we're happy to actually take your input, because in the end, we're not working for ourselves, we're working for the broader community. And this goes both ways, right? So this is why you as a consumer have a lot of power at Proton. So use it and help us improve.
Well, thank you for spending time with me and Andy. And an interesting story, as I was walking around the offices after this interview, I remember their office is just kind of these big open spaces. It's just an open style office. And I realized that Andy, I saw him working in the corner. He's not one of those CEOs. He's a very unassuming gentleman, very well spoken, obviously, but he doesn't have this corner window office at the Proton offices in Geneva. He works in the open space with everybody else, just a regular desk. And I don't know, something about that struck me as really cool. I like him, and I like the way that he has run this company. So if you enjoyed this, please give the video a like. I've got more content about Proton and the services that they offer, including their new Proton Pass and all these other things, as well as just some great regular privacy content that you can consume and hopefully learn more about how to take better care of your data and your privacy. Take care.